Can I get a show of hands? Excellent. Thank you so much for coming along tonight. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and I believe this is our first Politics in the Pub of 2024. So a big round of applause. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I want to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional owners of this land, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I did also want to acknowledge that 2024 is the Australia Institute's 30th anniversary. Can you believe it? Now, we've been doing Politics in the Pub for over a decade now, so you are part of our grand traditions and our marvellous history at changing minds and changing public policy. But I did kind of want to recognise that because the Australia Institute, as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations, we're bringing out some of the world's Sydney, and I believe there are 5 tickets left for Yanis at the National Press Club here on Wednesday the 13th of Canberra. So if you guys could spread the word and help us make that a sold out event too, that would be most wonderful. But you know, we really pride ourselves on bringing big new ideas into the Australian political debate. And so hosting Yanis Varoufakis, former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong, who will also be out later in March, and other amazing thinkers, as well as holding some amazing events this year and taking a look back at some of the Australia Institute's achievements will be some of the ways that we celebrate our 30th anniversary this year. And tonight, you are all here to help us celebrate one of the Australia Institute's biggest public policy wins, and that is the redesign of the Stage 3 tax cuts, which we're going to talk about tonight. Now, anyone who has been to Politics in the Pub before will have heard us talk about the Stage 3 tax cuts because we have been working on this issue for 5 years. So it's been a long time since Scott Morrison first introduced them. And I think tonight we'll kind of be able to explain to you, sometimes it's a bit hard, but what a think tank does and how we helped shape this policy debate and make space for the Labor government to change its mind and redesign these tax cuts. So I do want to say that we love putting these events on every month, and they are for free, but they're not free to hold for us. So there's a tap and go donation box at the bar, and you can just tap your card and chip in if you'd like to there. But also, if you want to think about becoming a regular donor to the Australia Institute, you can jump to australiainstitute.org.au and do that. We would very much appreciate it because we are powered by donations big and small. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our speakers for this evening. I've got Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute. A round of applause for Richard, please. And Matt Grudnoff, our senior economist, who personally, I think, wrote about 19 of our research reports on Stage 3. So he's a rock star internally at the Australia Institute. And I should give a shout out to our other colleagues in the room, Greg Jericho, David Richardson, I think Jack is here as well, and our comms team who promoted all of our research for 5 years until the government could no longer ignore it. Everyone has played a big role and it's a really big shift in public policy. So Richard, I recall that, you know, just a month ago, this almost seemed impossible. Can you just, for anyone who hasn't heard or doesn't know, tell us what's happened?
Yeah, thanks, Eb. And thanks, everyone, for coming. God love Canberra. Talk about tax. Woo, fill the house. And we'll come back to why tax is so important later because you can't do democracy without it. So big picture, Scott Morrison came up with the great idea of stages 1, 2 and 3 of tax cuts back in 2018. Everyone obviously remembers all the detail. The key thing to remember is that stages 1 and 2 were aimed at low income earners and they were small and temporary. And stage 3 was aimed at high income earners and it was enormous and permanent. But because he announced it back in 2018 to come in 2024, it didn't even show up in the budget papers. How much will it cost? Who cares? Literally, like it was just on the never, never. And this was, of course, was before COVID. And when asked, oh, can we afford $250 billion worth of tax cuts? Yeah. How? Oh, infinite economic growth. And then COVID. Can we still afford them? Yeah. How come? I don't know. Because when you want to give that much money to rich people, you don't have to cost it. You don't have to model it. You don't have to make a case for it. You just, no money for the unemployed, no money for housing, but plenty of money for those tax cuts.
But Richard, I do recall that we costed it back
We
in
did.
the day.
We did.
And
Well,
how did Scott Morrison respond to that?
well, I'll throw to Matt in a sec. But literally, so it was announced in the 2018 budget. Remember 2018? It was a long time ago.
That was Treasurer Scott Morrison, not Prime
That was
Minister
Treasurer Scott Morrison.
That's how far
Malcolm
long ago it
Turnbull,
was.
for those who are enjoying Nemesis. It's great. I just fall asleep listening to it again. It gets kind of relaxing. Not kidding. So yeah, Treasurer Scott Morrison, 2018, announced it, and as is the norm, after the budget, the Treasurer does a big kind of press conference, lunchtime event in the Great Hall at Parliament House, and Matt stayed up the night before, literally modelling the distribution of who would win and who would lose. So I think we probably should tell that story. But Matt, who won out of the Stage 3 tax cuts? I can't remember.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, we were the first out with an actual distribution model of who won and who lost. And it was obvious right from the start that it was mostly high income earners that were going to win. So a journalist asked Scott Morrison, you know, how can this be fair? And Scott Morrison basically mocked the modelling, said it was rubbish, smirked at us, and said, that he backs himself in to get this done.
Matt's left out the best bit. Matt's a better storyteller than that. The journalist actually said, according to the Australia Institute, the vast majority of this is going to go to high income earners. And Scott Morrison, you'll be surprised, smirked, laughed, said, the Australia Institute, my favourite think tank, and laughed again, and then dismissed our modelling out of hand and said he'd wait till some more reputable people did the modelling. And then more reputable people who are just actually as reputable as us but slower
got exactly the same results.
Got exactly the same results. And those results showed 6 years ago how overwhelmingly these tax cuts benefit high income earners. And for those that didn't pay attention, over $9,000 a year was the proposed tax cut for people earning over 200 grand. $9,000.
I'll just correct you on that. It's actually 11,000 because stage 1 and 2 gave a $2,000 tax cut to the top end.
This is why they let me talk more, Matt, because I was telling a simple story that was true, and you've told a more complicated story that no one understands. So the whole stage 1, 2, 3 thing was designed to confuse the bejesus out of people. It was designed to say, these tax cuts help everybody. They even confused Matt. Look, here's a little bit of money for poor people, and don't they need it right now? If you vote against these tax cuts, you must hate poor people. Why wouldn't you give poor people a little bit of money right now? Brackets, and a shitload of money to rich people in a few years. It was clever politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And, talking about the shift in this, so the Australian Institute, as I mentioned, we've been working on this since 2018. And we held little hope that the coalition government was going to change their minds on stage 3, but we thought it was really important because it was really flattening Australia's progressive income tax system. And that's one of the jewels in the crown of how our taxation system works. And it really prevents entrenched inequality, as the more you earn, the more you contribute. And so we obviously had a lot of economic issues, reasons why we thought the tax cuts weren't the right policy at that time. And that was really one of the key reasons for it, wasn't it, Richard? Because it was going to take out a whole tax bracket permanently.
Yeah, so we have a progressive income tax system. It's there's a hint in the name. It's progressive in every sense. As your income rises, your marginal tax rate rises. This is not a design flaw, it's a design feature. Most countries around the world have one. And one of the kind of right-wing fantasies in Australia for decades is to have what they just got a flat tax system. Wouldn't it be simple? They always say simple. Wouldn't it be simple if everyone paid the same tax rate? And yeah, if stage 3 had been implemented, everyone earning between about 45,000 and about 200,000 would have all been on the same tax rate. So we would really have moved from a progressive income tax system to a flat tax system.
And the simple argument's a fantastic argument because if you go back to the Menzies era, and my colleague Dave Richardson pointed this out.
He's not that old. Why are you pointing to Dave with the Menzies era?
He said that back then, before spreadsheets, before calculators, they had 19 tax brackets. So we have 4 at the moment. They had 19 back during the Menzies period. That pinko lefty Menzies. So, the idea that today with, spreadsheets and a tax office that basically just punches the numbers in, that somehow having that extra bracket was going to make everything really complicated and we could just simplify it and make everybody's life really easy. It's pretty laughable when you think about it.
Matt, I just, before we kind of go on to how these changes came about and what they mean, I do just kind of want to highlight some of the reasons that our research came up with to show why these were kind of flawed. And I'm just thinking of the 19 different research reports that you wrote. You looked at kind of the demographics, about professions. There was lots of different ways that you looked at how these tax cuts would impact on people. And what are some of the key things that your research found?
Yeah, so we looked at it by gender. So for every $1 of tax cut men would have got $2. We looked at professions, so that we were looking at, how much tax cuts went to surgeons and doctors and lawyers and stockbrokers versus how much went to people working in retail, people working in aged care, nurses, and surprise, surprise, stockbrokers got a lot more than nurses and people working in retail. We looked at the argument was often made that the stage 3 tax cut was just about bracket creep, that all it was doing was handing back bracket creep. Well, technically that was correct, except that it didn't hand back enough to low income people, so they still suffered from bracket creep, and it massively overcompensated high income people who got way more than their bracket creep and then some. So it wasn't if you were worried about bracket creep, the stage 3 tax cuts again were terrible. So we just looked at it from a whole lot of different points of view.
And Richard, for those who missed it, Richard was at the press club with Allegra Spender just after these changes were announced. How big is this change from the Labor government and what Anthony Albanese decided to do?
Oh, it's really, really significant. So effectively, if you compare the Scott Morrison stage 3 to what the Senate passed last night, effectively we shifted over, I think, $84 billion from the top 10% to the bottom and the middle. $84 billion. Yeah, thanks. I was going to say not a bad day's work, but it's actually 5 bloody years and about 1 million tweets. Yeah, but 84 billion shifted from the top to the bottom and the middle. Now, when the stage 3 tax cuts were first proposed, we said, look, we don't even need the tax cuts. And to be clear, I believed that then. And in those times, I think that was the right thing to say. I think a rich country like Australia needed to collect more tax and spend more money on health, more money on education, more money tackling climate change. Now, to be clear, the stage 3 tax cuts amended and passed, or not amended, passed by the Senate last night, are still big tax cuts. And I think we need to collect more tax, not less. So they're not perfect, what we did. But to be clear, I don't think we should have completely abolished these tax cuts now. I did think that in 2018. Now, here's why. In the last 3 years, real wages in Australia have fallen. Okay? Inflation has risen a lot faster than wages. So low and middle income earners, real wages are lower. Their purchasing power is lower. Their ability to go buy stuff at the shops is lower. They're worse off than they were a few years ago. But because of that progressive tax system, even though people's wages are lower in real terms, they're poorer than they were 2 years ago, they're paying more tax than they were a few years ago. So this is not the kind of scenario that fans of a progressive tax system have ever imagined. No one's ever sat down and thought, oh, I wonder what would happen if real wages fell year after year. The idea of a progressive income tax system is as we get richer, we pay a bit more tax. But because the tax thresholds are set in fixed dollar terms, nominal dollar terms, even though people's purchasing power's fallen, their tax bills have risen. So there's only two solutions. If you want to help low and middle income earners really struggling with the cost of everything, you can either get them a big wage rise or you can give them a tax cut. So even though I'm an unashamed fan for collecting more tax, I think given that we've had that much inflation and given that low and middle income earners are paying more tax now than they were when they were richer, we needed some tax cuts, big tax cuts for low and middle income earners. We didn't have to give $4,000 to people earning 200 grand, but that bit's politics.
So speaking of politics, I do want to talk about the politics of this, because for a long time, everybody told us this was impossible to do. Multiple times it was ruled out any changes by the coalition government. And then,
you mean in January?
That's right. And then in January, it still seemed like it wasn't going to happen. But Richard, you've written a lot about the actual politics of this for Labor, because there was a lot of conversation around the political cost of breaking an election promise. So how did you analyse the politics of this for Labor?
Yeah, so soon after the last election, 2022, Joe Stiglitz came out to Australia. The Australian Institute brought him out, and that was probably 3 months after the election, maybe less. And we had a lot of meetings with a lot of MPs. It's public, we met with the Prime Minister, we met with the Treasurer, we met with lots of people, and it wouldn't surprise anyone that we said, stage 3 is a crap idea, right? And what I said to every Labor MP I've met over the last 3 years, met to every member of the Labor Party, every union official I could get my hands on, to say, look, you just won the 2022 election, go you. What's going to happen is in the lead up to the 2025 election, you're about to give $9,000 to rich blokes and nothing to women earning below $45,000. That's what you got elected sticking with Morrison Stage 3. Yeah, you won an election. Your job is also to win the next election. And in the 6 months leading up to the next election, you got to give rich blokes $9 grand and low income women nothing. And they kind of go a bit wide. And then I say, but that's not the bad bit. Here's the bad bit. The coalition are going to run dead on this. They're going to run dead on this. They're not going to mention this right up until the day they come in. And the day they come in, the Australian and the Daily Telly and Peter Dutton are going to come out and say, you've done nothing to help poor people. And you're going to go, but they were Scott Morrison's tax cuts. And Dutton will say, yeah, but you've done nothing to help poor people. They're going to attack you from the left. And their face would get a little wider. And then I said, and by the way, if you actually change your policy, which is a good idea and it will be popular, what are the Libs going to do? Demand higher taxes for low and middle income earners? So pretty much everything played out the way that I think any clear-sighted political analysis should have said it would play out, except it just had the really hard bit where the Prime Minister had to go to the press club, which I went to, and it was a tough day in the office for him, where he just stood there for half an hour and got called a liar. Now, my line on the day, I don't know if anyone saw it at the press club, but I was supposed to be in the US, but the press club rang and asked me if I come to the press club to brag about stage 3. I said, sure. So when someone said, is it all right to break a promise? I said, I broke a promise to be here today. Circumstances change. That's what adults do. It's not good to break promises. It's not. And you shouldn't break a promise lightly. But if the circumstances change, if what was a good idea becomes a bad idea, hopefully you don't do it just because you used to think it was a good idea. So, yeah, the politics were tough, but they got there. And now the Australian runs front page. No poll bounce for Albo. Think about that. It was supposed to be devastating. If you break a promise, no one will ever trust you again. And now they're getting criticised for not getting a bounce out of it.
And it certainly didn't take long for the coalition to change its mind. I believe the day that this was announced, Susan Ley was out there defending the stage 3 tax cuts, and I think within 24 hours had kind of walked that back. And for those of you, unlike us, who don't sit up late at night watching the Senate, it passed on the voices. It passed unanimously. So they didn't even call a vote last night. It went through the Senate pretty much unanimously. So that was the coalition's response in the end. But Matt, we've kind of talked about that shift of over $80 billion to low and middle income earners. But what are some of the other key elements of this? I believe there's a bunch of people getting a tax cut who weren't previously. Is that right?
Yeah, so under the original Stage 3, the Scott Morrison Stage 3, anybody under 45,000 would get nothing at all. And they're the ones who are suffering the most in our cost of living crisis. They're the ones whose real wages, like everybody, has gone back, but they've got obviously less reserves. They're poorer. They're less able to handle this cost of living crisis, and they were going to get absolutely nothing. Whereas under these changed tax cuts, everybody who pays tax gets a tax cut. So it goes all the way down to the tax-free threshold. So there's a heap of people, probably about a third of taxpayers, about 30%, so a little bit less than a third, that were going to get no tax cut under Scott Morrison's Stage 3, who are now going to get a tax cut.
So it's a pretty big change. And just before we wrap up this victory lap and move on to other things, I did just kind of want to talk about how we think tanked this one, how we helped create the circumstances that persuaded the government to shift its mind on this. Because, as I said, for a long time, there was just everyone telling us that it couldn't be done. And I did just want to shout out, in particular, the comms team. So Eleanor is here tonight, Eleanor Johnston-Leake. And we had a listicle that was 18 reasons why the Stage 3 tax cuts should be rejigged. Once upon a time was why they should be scrapped, back when economic circumstances were different. But for a long time, Eleanor was just tweeting every single day different reasons why the Stage 3 tax cuts. And I'm sure it was got boring on some days, but it really is part of how the Australia Institute really helped to keep this issue a live political issue, because as far as a lot of people were concerned, it was done and dusted. It was legislated. There was no bill before Parliament that we could lobby parliamentarians to talk about. And so, it has been, I think, a real effort from organisations like the Australia Institute, like the union movement, who was very vocal about how unfair this was, particularly for low and middle income earners and for a lot of working Australians. A lot of other charities and people working with those who are really struggling to make ends meet, were very vocal about how unfair the Stage 3 tax cuts were. So I'm talking charities that work in the aged care sector, in the healthcare sector, people who work with the unemployed and things like that. A lot of people were drawing attention to how unfair these tax cuts were over a long time. And it really does take, I think, the collective voices of a lot of people to, one, persuade the government that the problem was big enough that they needed to change their mind on things, but also to bring the rest of the parliament along for the ride. So people, talk to the Teal independents, and we certainly polled a bunch of Teal seats over the years. And what we found actually was that a lot of high income earners really didn't think, they could see that the Stage 3 tax cuts that Scott Morrison had designed were unfair. And there was a lot of support for changing or scrapping them amongst high income earners even. So those are some of the ways that we talked about this over the years, and a lot of revenue summits, Richard, in Parliament House.
Yeah, I was going to add a couple of things. But in 2019, long time ago, but in 2019, when Bill Shorten was ALP leader, Labor went to the 2019 election, opposed the Stage 3 tax cuts. Their vote went up in all the high income seats. Their vote went up in Kooyong, their vote went up in Goldstein, their vote went up in Wentworth, their vote went up in North Sydney, their vote went up in Mackellar. Can anyone see the pattern of what happened in 2019? The Liberal vote fell in all the what we now think of as Teal seats. So we're told all the time, as if it's true, and it's not, that everybody thinks about themselves, that everyone only thinks about money, that you're naive to think otherwise. And in 2019, when Bill Shorten went to the election saying, let's scrap the stage 3 tax cuts, let's increase capital gains tax, and let's limit negative gearing, and let's get rid of franking credits. In 2019, when Bill Shorten said those 4 very progressive things, Labor's vote went up, up, up in all the high-income seats, all the seats that are now held by the Teals. Labor lost Bass and Braddon in 2019. Some Tasmanians up the front. These are the lowest income seats in the country. Labor lost the low income seats in 2019. And Scott Morrison held a majority of what, 1? So the idea that voters just think about their hip pockets never, ever, ever been true. Of course they think about benefits to themselves, but it's actually just neoliberal propaganda that we can't propagate ourselves to say, oh, all the rich people only think about themselves. No, a whole bunch of high-income earners in high-income electorates went, well, my kid's never going to be able to afford to buy a house. Or I don't actually need a $9,000 tax cut. I'm so rich. Thank you very much. But you know what? Free childcare would be nice, or free cancer treatment, as Labor proposed in the 2019 election. So yeah, so reminding people of that history was a big part of what we did. We did a whole bunch of polling. We did polling straight after the last election saying, did voters think it was more important for Labor to keep a promise or do what was right for the economy? 66% of people said do what's right for the economy. Now that
even if it means breaking a promise, that was in the question.
It was the opposite of a push poll. It was like, Labor promised to do this. Do you think they should break a promise? What's more important? And 2/3 of people said do the right thing. So, again, these kind of norms that we're fed by, conservative media, it's not how most people think.
We're going to come to questions from the audience in just a second. So get your thinking caps on if you've got a good question for Richard or Matt, and you don't have to confine yourselves to stage 3 tax cuts. There's lots of other stuff happening at the moment.
What else is there?
I did kind of also want to mention the work that Greg Jericho had done in modelling different options that Labor could take up in order to change the stage 3 tax cuts. And Greg tried really, really hard to spend $250 billion and just came up with 4 different ways and always had money left over. That was how big they were. But I think that was really important about showing that there were other ways to do it, essentially, and thinking about what tangibly the government could do to shift and redesign these tax cuts to make them fairer. But I did also just want to think about some of the other issues that the Australia Institute has been working on for a long time. And that is, I don't know if you remember because it's pre-pandemic now, but we used to have a massive national obsession with debt and deficit, with delivering a budget surplus, and all that kind of got blown out of the water with COVID and the big job seeker and job keeper schemes, the wage subsidy scheme that the government delivered, which we thought was a really good idea at the time, and we backed that. But overall, for a number of years, the Australia Institute has really put an effort in shifting that debate away from some of those really simplistic ways of looking at the economy and talking about why tax is important, why it's an investment in society, and why we need more revenue for things. Matt, there's no shortage of things that need more government spending at the moment. Can you just tell us a little bit about why that's been a focus of the Australia Institute?
Yeah, look, I mean, if you think about, over the last 10 years or longer, hospital waiting lists are longer. It's harder and harder to find a bulk GP to bulk bill. Public schools aren't needs funded, despite the Gonski recommending it a decade or more ago. We've had royal commissions into aged care and disability care that have shown horrible things that are happening. There is nowhere in public housing has been underfunded for decades. There's nowhere where there isn't a need for more government intervention, for a bigger government, for more spending. And we just think that the only way you can do that in the long term, the only way you can carve out a larger space for the public sector that everybody wants is to have more taxation. And so, I've seen my role and the other economists at the Institute role to try and find the best way of raising that tax, because you can tax a whole lot of different ways. There are good ways and there are bad ways. And we just wanted to have an honest debate about how to raise more tax.
Yeah, Richard, I just want to highlight one of the things that you mentioned that pretty much went viral at the press club about HECS. What was the point you were trying to make there?
Australia collects more revenue each year from HECS than it does from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. We have this thing called the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. It's a special tax. It's a special tax designed to make sure we get our fair share for taxpayers from the from the gas industry. The gas industry's gone through enormous boom thanks to a war in the Ukraine. The price of oil went up, their profits went through the roof. And next time you hear someone say, you know, the gas industry and their taxes they pay are the backbone of their country, think, no, kids are. Kids going to uni. We get more money from HECS than we do from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. And by the way, we've got a petition up at the moment trying to encourage the government to increase the petroleum resource.
But Richard, you might say you'd want to subsidise unis and, you know, and try to prevent carbon emission producing fossil fuels.
Matt, how many times do I have to tell you? We need to subsidise the fossil fuel industry.
To 11 billion a year, I believe.
Yeah, we need to tax the kiddies and we need to subsidise. It's economics 101.
It's obvious when you think about it.
If you're a foreign owner of a fossil fuel company whose kids go to uni somewhere else, why the hell would you want to pay tax and spend money to educate someone else's kids when you could actually get a country as rich as us to be stupid enough to subsidise you? In Labor's first budget, the mini budget, in October 2022, there was $1.5 billion in a new cash subsidy for the Northern Territory's Middle Arm gas project. $1.5 billion for a new gas project. We are not transitioning away from fossil fuels. We are hurtling headlong into a fossil fuel expansion. And the budget papers are the most honest thing about a government and about a parliamentary democracy's priorities. It tells you who gets the cash and who pays. You can't spin your way out of those numbers. And of course, for a politician, everything's a priority and we're transitioning to do this and I'm going to help Matt, I'm going to help Ebony, but the budget papers just strip it all away. And they tell you, where does the cash come from and who do we give it to? 11 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies, and we charge our kids a fortune to go to uni. Anyone know what they charge to go to uni in Norway? Nothing. But gee, they tax the bejesus out of their gas industry. It's as if democratic choices matter. They tax their fossil fuel industry and give kids free university. We subsidise our fossil fuel industry and we charge our kids a fortune to go to uni. That's democracy right there. That's priorities right there. Don't ever think politics doesn't matter. It matters enormously.
So we've got a lot of time for questions from the audience, and we've got a lovely microphone just down here. I'll put my Q&A hat on. Yeah, please come on down. I'll put my Q&A hat on and just request that everyone asks a question and not makes a speech. We'd be most grateful. Yeah, our first question. Thank you.
Just two quick questions. Does the Australia Institute have a view about negative gearing, whether it should be abolished or just tweaked? And secondly, what's the Institute's view on other controversial tax issues like inheritance tax, wealth tax, and raising the GST to 15%?
We didn't even organise this, Dorothy Dixer, you guys.
Yes, and yes, we want them all. Look, negative gearing. Let's So the simple answer is we should fix or scrap negative gearing. But there's a more complicated answer. So slight historical context. We've had negative gearing in Australia forever, and it hasn't worked. Our housing is shit. Right? So it doesn't work. The idea that, oh, thank God we've got negative gearing, that'll encourage private investment and then house prices will fall. It didn't work, did it? Right? So negative gearing doesn't do the thing it's supposed to do. But negative gearing actually means you buy an investment property and you lose money on the investment property and your loss is tax deductible. Now, losing money is a bit of a bad idea. Why do people get rich losing money? The answer is because while they're losing money year on year while they're owning these houses and renting them out, when they sell the house, they make big capital gain, and we have these thing, there's a hint in the name, the capital gains tax discount. And it's that combination of negative gearing in the short term and the 50% capital gains tax discount in the long term. Those two things really work to advantage investors. So if you picture an auction with two people at the auction, me, the first home buyer, Matt, an investor, Matt gets these really generous tax breaks. I don't. So even if we've got the same post-tax income, we've got the same job, same amount of money in the bank, the house is worth more to Matt because of the tax breaks. Wealth tax, of course. Australia is one of the few countries to not have one. And just quickly, you hear the right-wingers all the time say Australia's system is too reliant on personal income tax. Too reliant on personal income tax. I can fix that real easy. Get a wealth tax. Get a carbon tax. Get a resource rent tax. Right? The solution, if you think we're over-reliant on income tax, easy. How about we do all the things they do in other countries, introduce the other taxes? So, yeah, no, tick to all of those things, and we've certainly done a lot of research on it over the years.
Matt, anything you want to add?
Yeah, look, only that, investors invest for yield, which is a simple way of saying if you're a property investor and you're investing in a house, you should be interested in how much rent you can make. You should be positively geared, right? You should be making money on it. Speculation, the definition of speculation is just buying an asset because you think it's going to go up in price later. So if you've got a bunch of people who are negatively gearing and are just hoping that the price will go up later, what you're talking about is pure speculation. And that's what we've encouraged with our tax system. We've encouraged people to speculate in the property market. The price has gone up, and guess what? We forced a whole heap of people out of that market. Now, there's lots of things you could speculate on. You can speculate on the stock market. You can speculate in the bond market. But if the price of stocks and bonds goes up, it doesn't mean people are homeless. It doesn't mean people can't find a home to live in. And so I reckon housing is the worst place to speculate.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you so much. A question for each of you. Richard, I was really curious. You got into the Teals dynamic within Parliament, and I was keen to understand if you think 18 months in they still have power, particularly economic power, any power to influence that policy. And then, Matt, I was interested to know from you, you talked a lot about, you both did, talked a lot about taxation and its generation of wealth for the economy. I was curious to get your take on the use of preventive spending to generate income. So, for example, preventive health mechanisms, etc.
Look, just quickly, at the moment, the Labor Party has a parliamentary majority in the lower house, so it doesn't need the support of the Teals to pass a bill. And the Greens are in balance of power in the upper house, which simply means if the opposition oppose, they need to get the Green support. So in terms of constitutional power, no, the Teals don't have much at the moment. But power is, the Australia Institute has no constitutional power, but I think we can influence decisions. And I think the Teals can and have and likely will continue to. Why? Well, because they took what were the Liberals' safest seats. Sophie Scomp's won Mackellar on, I think, a 15% swing. This is inconceivable. If I said to you 10 years ago that the Liberal Party would lose Kooyong, that the Liberal Party would lose Goldstein, that the Liberal Party would lose Mackellar, who too? Oh, some community independents. So the Liberal Party is scared right now today of losing more seats to those independents. The National Party are now saying, oh, hang on, maybe supporting fracking in a farming community might cost us a seat. So what the Teals have done in some sense, along with other independents, they weren't the first independents there, along with other minor parties, the Jackie Lambie Party, the Bob Catter, they're breaking a business model that it has to be Labor or Liberal. And when you break that business model, when people see that there are alternatives, members of Parliament who for a decade have thought, I can never lose my seat, I can look after my friends, I don't care about, what other people think. Not many when Sophie Scomps can beat someone on 16% from a walk-up start with no cash in the bank, there's no such thing as a safe seat in Australia anymore, literally. No such thing as a safe seat.
And that's good for democracy.
It's great for democracy. I've said a million times in a forum like this, politicians only respond to two things: pain and the threat of pain. No, it's their job, right? They cop enormous pressure from all directions and they have to make hard decisions, and it can't make everybody happy. So if you can't make them scared by if I can ignore you and you can't hurt me, then I'll help Matt, who I think can hurt me. Well, they all now feel that their communities can hurt them, and that's good. They're listening.
And Matt?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think one of the problems we have at the moment, because we don't collect enough tax, is that politicians, when a problem is confronting them, whichever government is in power, they put up solutions that kind of don't do the job but look like they might, or they kind of half solve the problem. So we have a Royal Commission into aged care. They'll put up some extra funding, but not enough to actually solve the problem. And so, and that actually costs more money in the long run, as you say, because like if you actually get in and solve the problem, a great example is preventative health. If you get in and you fund GPs properly, so that people can find a bulk bill doctor, they can get there, that the GPs work in teams with other specialists. We make that system work, then we catch things early, and it doesn't cost you for expensive treatment in hospitals later. So absolutely, we need to get away from this kind of half-assed. Every budget, we have a couple of things that we're going to half-ass kind of fix, but not really actually fix, and just waste money on effectively, and actually get in and actually solve problems.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing. I think there's people around the world are losing faith in democracy, which is a bit terrifying. One of the reasons is it's a long time since they've seen government work well. Why doesn't government work well? Because it's actually afraid to implement big, bold solutions that would work. So all these sort of half-assed announceables that sound like I've heard your problem, but I know I'm not going to fix it, right? It gets me through the news cycle. It might even get me through the election.
When the minister gets asked a question, he's got a list of things that he can quote off.
Look at all the things we said we do, but did you fix housing? No. Is it cheap? No. Do people think you're shit? Yes. So there's a real democratic cost to this kind of, buck passing, kick into the long grass, pretend setting up a $10 billion fund will fix housing or something. Whereas, I hate to tell you, it's really simple sometimes. You go look at the Nordic countries, they collect more tax and they got free childcare. Does that help with the cost of living? Yeah, just a little bit. Free healthcare. Does that help with the cost of living? Yeah, just a little bit. Do they have more faith in democracy? Heaps.
Can I interrupt with an Australian example? Going back to the pandemic, when the Morrison government implemented JobKeeper and JobSeeker, it lifted, I think, a few 100,000 people.
800,000.
800,000 people out of poverty by giving, in particular, people who are unemployed $500 extra. It raised them above the poverty line for the first time in a very long time, made childcare free for a long time, or only temporarily though. And that helped a lot of people. And if you look at the polling during that time, trust and faith in democracy and support for the government went through the roof, not only for the Prime Minister, but all the state premiers as well, because it was very visible what the government was doing to help people. And so, yeah, it makes a real difference. And that's from only a few years ago. Next question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for that talk. My question is primarily to Richard, but feel free for the whole panel to discuss it. Given since your debate with Innes Willox, where he declared that tax reform is now dead, what do you think will be the next arena for tax reform that was previously seen as impossible, but is actually more possible than what people would otherwise think, especially since the changes of the stage 3 tax cuts?
Yeah, thank you. What a great question. And yes, if you Google my interview with Innes Willox, I think you'll enjoy it. I did. I don't think Innes enjoyed it as much. I might have called him a bit of a greedy, selfish person. But look, in the short term for the Australian Institute, we're straight onto this Petroleum Resource Rent Tax thing. To be clear, this is by no means the biggest thing that needs to happen, but there'll be a bill before Parliament, before the budget, where the government has got the opportunity, if it wants, to collect a shit ton more money from the gas industry. The Greens will try to amend this bill to say, how about this? The crossbench will try to amend this bill to say, how about we collect a lot more tax? And the most likely thing Labor will say is, no, we don't want the money. Keep it, gas industry. We've got a budget to balance. We've got demands for more health and more education. Keep your money, gas industry. So we need to expose the absurdity of that. But that's only a small thing. We had a staff get together a couple of weeks ago, and I was at the optimistic end of, how much impact the Australian Institute would have in the coming year. And the reason I was at the optimistic end was I said, look, after the stage 3 tax cut, we've actually opened up the whole terrain, as you just alluded to. And a week later, Rod Sims and Ross Garnaut showed up at the press club and said, how about $100 billion carbon tax? And Andrew Forrest this week said the same thing. Now, I'm not saying they said that because of us. I'm saying that now that the stage 3 tax cuts have been radically altered and everyone's gone, yeah, good idea, move on. Next, there's no reason that we can't, to use a technocratic term, broaden the Overton window. The scope for debate is bigger now. And to be clear, and Matt, I think I'm about right on this, but if we did what Ross Garnaut and Rod Sims said, two well-known pinko lefties who, no one's ever trusted before, and collected an extra $100 billion a year in tax just from the fossil fuel industry, right? Not from you, not from your petrol bill, from the fossil fuel industry. Matt, if we collected an extra $100 billion in tax this year, where would we fit in the OECD?
We would come in just under the average. We'd need another 5 or 10 billion to get us right on the average, but we would be an average taxing nation amongst first world nations.
We are such a low tax country that if we collected an extra lazy 100 billion, we still wouldn't be average. That's why other people have nice things. That's why other countries give their kids free university. That's why other countries give parents free childcare, because they collect the lazy 100 bill, and that only makes you average. The Norwegians and the Danes and the Swedes they'll chuck another 100 on top.
Yeah, and look, the other big issue, I think, is negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. That's why the Liberal Party are going to it, because they know that housing is the biggest of issues, and they know that every policy that we've currently heard from both sides is one of those bullshit policies that won't do anything. Whereas if you actually got in and got the speculators out of the market, you would actually make housing affordable. And also you'd raise $10+ billion, which you could then plough into even more public housing or into other areas. So yeah, that's where I think the debate will go, just because there are just so many people now who are hurting from housing, that it is such a large group that in a democracy you just can't ignore them.
Thanks very much. Next question.
I've tried twice now. I think you've already answered my question. It's around negative gearing and appetite change, but I'm going to ask it. We've been told since the 2019 election.
Go up to the mic.
Sorry, we've been told since the 2019 election that negative gearing and franking credits are the third rail, right? And you spoke about making room for the conversation to happen and making room for the government to change their mind on that. What do you think needs to happen to make room for that change?
Look, great question. And there's no simple answer. And, perception is everything in politics. I just said before, in the 2019 election, the Labor Party's vote went up in all the highest income electorates. And Labor lost Bass and Braddon, two of the lowest income electorates in the country. I promise you that there aren't many people getting franking credits in Bass and Braddon. But everyone knew after the election that Labor lost because of franking credits. No, they didn't. But when you lose and you're the loser who lost, after an election you sit there and you just take it, while the winners tell everybody what they want everyone to remember. I did not invent the idea that winners write history, but I promise you winners write history. So, of course, the Liberals came out after the election and said, we know why they lost. They lost because they did this, and this. So we know that's not true from the electoral returns, but I can understand why Labor are nervous about going straight back to a policy that they took to an election that they lost. But I guess, and I mean this seriously, although it sounds a bit dismissive. That's not our problem. Right? We're a think tank. We try to tell people what we think based on our research will work and won't work. It's not our job to solve what a party thinks is the political third rail. I'll have a conversation with them. I'll try to persuade them. But ultimately, if someone doesn't want to do it, they're not going to do it. But that's why the Teals and the minor parties and the independents are actually so important. Because while if you think in kind of military strategy, if you've got Labor and Liberal over here having a little fight or having a big fight about little things, they've actually just vulnerable on their flanks. They've just got young people saying, I don't care what you said, mate, I can't afford a house. Or I don't care what you said, you're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, that's fucking crazy, right? So so if they believe they can't do something and they're stuck in a logjam where they can't do something, 10 years ago that meant nothing could happen. Now it means they'll both lose seats to people that'll try and do something.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in with that. I think it is something that neither Labor or Liberal would like to talk about, negative gearing and capital gains tax discount in particular. And I was just going to comment on the fact that I think the Greens party will make that a big issue. I think they've done a lot to raise the issue of renters and how unaffordable rent is at the moment, and how hard it is for renters to find places to live. And so, yeah, as Richard points out, I think that diversity in the parliament is going to contribute to making that space for the tax reform debate in that area. Next question.
Yeah, sorry, can I just add one thing? The other thing that I think is going to happen is after the 2019 election and Labor decided that they were going to support stage 3, we got out there and we told them, no, it's crap. And actually, our biggest advocate for this scrapping the stage 3 tax cuts was the stage 3 tax cuts. They were just so terrible that everybody could see they were terrible. And I think the same is with negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. We just need to get out there and explain to everybody how terrible they are. And people will go, yeah, they're terrible. Why isn't the government doing something? And you will find that, people will turn around, parliamentarians will turn around and go, yeah, actually, we need to do something. They'll change it. And guess what? They'll get a bump in the polls.
Next question. Thank you.
It bends.
Thanks so much. Thanks for being here tonight in this great discussion. I just wanted to raise something maybe slightly left field, but one of the things I've very rarely heard spoken about in Australia is whether there's any role in the tax system for encouraging environmentally sustainable behaviour. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. So to take a totally hypothetical example, imagine you have a person living on their own without a partner, without kids, without a car, in high density living that is a rental.
I resemble that remark.
Not saying it resembles anyone here, but I think in theory it's fair to say that that person might have some of the highest living costs and some of the lowest environmental impact, but also per capita pay quite a high tax rate and have very few tax benefits when you look at tax benefits for things related to children, things related to this, things related to that. So I just wondered if you think there's any merit in the idea of, tax benefits for sustainable behavior and maybe even tax, penalties for non-sustainable behavior, or do you think, for example, going after the 11 billion in subsidies is just a way more efficient way to make environmental gains?
Yeah, look, what a good question. I guess my starting point is, do no harm. We're still subsidizing people to do bad things. So that you're spot on. I guess that's our starting point. Like if we want to live in a country that pretends to care about the climate and we want to subsidize building new fossil fuel projects, frankly, we're hypocrites and liars. We need to fix that. Should we have a tax system and or other regulatory and other systems in place that encourage people to undertake some activities and discourage them from doing others? Yeah, we do that all the time. I mean, we tax smoking, we subsidise vaccinations, we tax alcohol, we subsidise solar panels on roofs. What you're asking about, I think, is harder because you're actually saying, well, what about if it's not my consumption behaviour but my life choices? Interestingly, the Howard government certainly had the opposite idea. We had a baby bonus where we were paying people, here, have another one. Whereas, you've made the point, well, look, if I've got no dependents and I'm not kind of creating anywhere near as much waste, why should I sort of pay that? Well, again, I think the baby bonus was a crap idea. So first, do no harm. And, here in the ACT, I think the government has tried to change the land tax rates in some ways to reduce the cost. If someone living in a small house contributes less now to ACT revenue than previously, to try and slightly do that. But I really think the hard part of your question is getting a room full of people to agree whether we should be helping young parents with the cost of kids or rewarding young people without kids. I'll let you pick that fight.
Thanks.
And you've given me some ideas for future staff meetings to bring up there. We've probably only got time for 2 more questions. I'm really sorry. But yeah, if you want to ask yours, and then I might get the next question asked as well, and we'll see what we can do to answer them all. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks so much. It's been a very good, entertaining set so far. I've just got a quick question about inflation. Given that Woolworths may announce $1.6 billion in profit, the way we look at inflation seems a bit batshit crazy in the fact that a rent super tax shouldn't just be on one industry. It should just be on people who just pull the piss. The second part would be around, there's a really good article written by Gruen a couple of years ago about super being a mechanism for inflation rather than interest rates. Like, I guess my question is around, can we change how we look after the inflation pressures and not just bullshit the electorate around what things that actually don't matter? It's just always emphasised. Sorry.
No, great question. And I'll grab that next question. Can I get your question as well?
Thank you all for making tax sexy to fill a room. My question's got to change. Of all the good ideas around the world, which you hinted to, Richard, for example, in Italy, they tax cars based on the CC, so smaller cars less, big cars more. America, you can deduct your home mortgage. In Australia, we could give one property, investment property, the full benefit, and then subsequent properties reduced to zero. Norway, resource tax. Japan, the holy grail here, or sacred cow, your home is protected from capital gains tax. In Japan, under 300,000 you keep, over 300,000 you go into a marginal capital gains tax scheme. So the guy buying the house on Sydney Harbour for 20, selling it for 50, walks away with 30 mil clear. The guy in the burbs with a $600,000 apartment makes 100. My question is, do you think a 4-year tax term, 4-year government term may influence the way that the politicians have got the guts to make a hard decision?
Okay, so just a reminder, first question was inflation, second was that question.
So I'll take the second one first. No, I don't think 4 years would help at all. I think it would give governments an extra year to dither and do nothing before we could put pressure on them. I like democracy. I don't buy we just need to leave the bureaucrats alone for a long period of time to get the stuff done. I don't buy it. I think that pressure works, and we need to put pressure on politicians. And imagine if Scott Morrison had been in for 5 years, would he have got better stuff done? No, because it cuts both ways, right? No, I'm fine with 3. Don't care about fixed, but I don't think longer would help. And in terms of inflation, great question. Just a short answer. The idea that interest rates are the only or the best way to control inflation, I think that ship has sailed. I don't think it was ever inevitably true. It's clearly the case now. It's not the best. And we spent the early part of that inflationary boom saying, how about this for a crazy idea? What if we reduced inflation by giving people free childcare? Do you want to go back over that again? It's quite complicated, isn't it? Like you drop the price of things to zero as a way to control inflation. What if you drop the price of medicine? What if you drop the price of going to university? All those things are included in the basket of goods in CPI, right? So there are obvious ways where governments can directly do things to control prices. I don't want them to control all prices. I don't want them to set the price of coffee, but private health insurance is an unnecessary product. You don't even need private health insurance, according to rich, happy, healthy countries. So there are all sorts of ways we could control the cost of living by collecting more tax and spending money in much, much better ways. And we need to get out of this idea that some genius at the RBA tweaking interest rates by 0.25% will solve all our problems. What nonsense.
Matt, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just on the monetary policy. I mean, it's just history that we use interest rates to suck money out of the economy or inject it in. It impacts people with large mortgages, which are more likely to be young people who've just bought a house at a really high price. We could, and it hits a very small group. So in order to take X amount of demand out of the economy, you've got to hit that one group really hard because they're only a small group. Whereas if you had something like super, not only would you actually not, in the long term, not taking any money away from somebody, you basically just put it more into their retirement. With interest rates, all it does is benefit banks. Banks make bigger profits. So
Don't forget rich people with money in the bank.
I'm just going to ask one more, Dorothy Dixer, on that because one of the questions talked about Woolworths' profit. And for a long time, we were talking about the role of profits in the economy, Richard, and no one really wanted to hear about it, including the RBA. What's happened on that front?
Just one Dorothy Dixer after another tonight. So a couple of years ago, Dave Richardson and Greg Jericho here did some great work showing that in Australia it was profit growth that was driving inflation. Profit growth, not wage growth, profit growth. And we had the audacity to publish this research. The Australian Financial Review said we should retract it. Treasury said it was flawed. The Reserve Bank said it was, broken. Everyone said we were full of crap.
And then the day after, the OECD came out with exactly the same analysis for all countries, including Australia.
And exactly. Well done, Dave and Greg and Matt and others. And to be clear, the OECD is now run by that well-known pinko lefty, Matthias Cormann. Thanks, Matthias, for riding over the hill just in time to come to our defence. So this was always the case. It was always true. But, again, in Australia, just because you read it in the newspapers doesn't mean it's true. We've just been told for so long that wage growth causes inflation that it was just heresy to say, well, profit growth can cause inflation too, and not only can, but is. We came out and we said that. It was rather controversial. A lot of people got very sad, but we were, as they say in economics, right. And what we're now seeing is, so that was at a macroeconomic level. We were using national accounts data to say this was what's happening. Well, what we're now seeing is the companies reporting on their results, right? You're seeing Coles and Woolworths and all sorts of companies still posting these big profits. Why are their profits high? Because their prices are rising faster than their costs. Do you follow that? Their prices are rising faster than their costs. That is, their profits are causing our inflation. So why would we increase your interest rates to solve that problem? I mean, this is just broken economic thinking. But when we increase interest rates, rich people with money in the bank get higher interest rates. It's not like everyone loses when interest rates go up. It makes life a misery for young people with big mortgages. It's just nice, high return, low risk.
We are going to have to wrap it up there. I've had a really fantastic night tonight. Great vibe in the crowd. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. And really, thank you for supporting the Australia Institute's research on stage 3 over a marathon slog of 5 years. And forgive us if we seem a bit giddy up on stage here tonight, but it is not often that we successfully shift $80 billion to low and middle income earners. And we think it is really significant in a number of ways, as we've talked about tonight, not just for what it's materially going to do for people who are really doing it tough, but for what it does for the Australian political debate, hopefully, as well.
Can I just say one thing?
Please.
Everyone said it was impossible. It was never inevitable. But as Eb said, not just us, working with a lot of other people, we took bipartisan consensus that was inevitable and it changed. Well, this applies to everything in a democracy. We spend a lot of time saying we've got to stop subsidising new coal mines and gas and we've got to stop doing that and you can't tackle climate change. And at the moment it feels crazy because as if you could ever win a fight with the gas industry. Well, we have to. We have to. But just because people say the government will never change its mind doesn't mean they're right. Everyone thought the government wouldn't change its mind about stage 3. So we're just so beaten down with, you don't understand, you're being naive, you're being utopian. Norway does exist. Right? It's a real place.
You can find it on a
You
map.
find it on a map. I've even been there, checked it out for myself. Right? There's people working around, lots of money, lots of free childcare. So, I guess we are pretty chuffed about the stage 3 tax cuts, but Australia's a long way from fixed. But unless you believe it can change, it can't change. And indeed, the real power of the status quo is to convince you it can't. And you're just silly and naive for trying. That's bullshit.
On that note, thank you very much. The Australia Institute is hosting something like 20 events across the country in the next 3 weeks. We've got Yanis Varoufakis coming out. We've got Anote Tong, the former president of Kiribati, coming out to talk about Australia's fossil fuel exports in the Pacific. There's a Tasmanian election on. If you know anyone down in Tassie, we've got 3 election events happening on ending native forest logging, ending salmon farming in Macquarie Harbour to save the endangered Maugean skate, and something on integrity. We've got Yanis Varoufakis at the Press Club. We've got webinars with Stephanie Kelton coming up about modern monetary theory and her new documentary that's also showing in Canberra. We've got a webinar next Friday about AUKUS and the latest issue of Australian Foreign Affairs. It's called Dead in the Water, and it's basically about all the problems with AUKUS. And someone handed me this flyer that my colleague Alan Beam is talking at a rally on the 18th of March on the Parliament House lawns to say no to AUKUS. Organised by the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network. Hugh White will also be appearing at that. But head on over to australiainstitute.org.au. There's so many things where we can shift the dial, and coming along to events like this and really participating in our democratic debate is one of the ways we try and make that shift happen. So check them all out. Don't forget to think about becoming a monthly donor. Thanks so much for coming along tonight. And next month, our Politics in the Pub is on housing. It's with Cam Murray, an economist that we've worked with in the past. He's got a new book out called The Great Housing Hijack. He's going to be coming to talk to you about how we fix the housing market. That's on Thursday, March the 21st. And 2 last plugs. Follow the Money is our podcast where we explain big political and economic issues in plain English. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally find podcasts. And Greg Jericho, our chief economist, has a new podcast about the economy and what's happening in it and explaining it in simple ways. That's called Dollars and Cents. Check that out as well. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've been a really wonderful audience, and I hope to see you again next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ed.